Is there anything that unites their journey to those streets? Were they all, by the time of their death, pretty economically, socially marginalised?
For the most part, yes. I mean, there are lots of factors that led to eventually where they ended up. One was, society did not offer a lot of opportunities for working class women, for unskilled labor. So, for example, if a woman fell on hard times, if a woman didn't have a man to support her, she could not be a breadwinner. She could not earn a substantial income through women's work, through things like working as a seamstress, working at something called slop work, working as a charwoman, working as a laundress. All of these occupations paid really, really minimal, and a woman needed a man to support her. So in a lot of these cases, these women had problems. Their marriages broke down. They found themselves really dispossessed. A lot of them had addiction issues. There were issues of domestic violence. And really, there was nowhere for these women to turn. They turned to the workhouse. Workhouse existence was terrible. And they bounced largely between the workhouse and also tramping. And it's this story of tramping and homelessness which has gone really undiscussed in the history of these women before this.
Tell me, what is tramping?
Well, every workhouse had something called a casual ward, and a casual ward was like temporary accommodation. It wasn't a full commitment into the workhouse. It was a place where you could spend a night, and then later in the century, the legislation was changed to suggest that people who went into a casual ward needed to spend at least one full day laboring there for their bed and board, so they would spend 2 nights there. And what you did is you turned up, you queued up in the middle of the afternoon for just an execrable sort of bed and terrible food like porridge, and there were reports of porridge was called skilly. It was this kind of watered, grainy stuff. A lot of it was contaminated. The food was awful. People were sick. You lived in these kind of stinking, awful dormitories. There was violence. There was all sorts of extortion from the people who ran the casual wards and the workhouses. It was a terrible experience, but these were places that were set up for vagrants who had nowhere to go, because the idea was that vagrancy was unlawful and we should provide places for people temporarily until they could earn money to get accommodation. So these were effectively homes for the homeless. So what ends up happening is, if you don't have any money and if you don't have a job, you start tramping, which means you move from one casual ward to the next. But what people don't realize is you didn't always have a roof over your head every single night. A lot of times you were sleeping rough. Sometimes you could queue up and there weren't any beds left in the casual ward. Sometimes you might get a couple of pennies, 4 pence for a bed in a lodging house. Lodging houses were called places of accommodation for homeless people. And so you had this circulation between all of these 3 options: sleeping on the street, the casual ward, the horrible lodging houses, which were, sometimes as bad as the casual ward, except you didn't have to work. And tramping was effectively what today we would consider a state of homelessness. You had to beg for your sustenance. You had to get odd jobs. You never knew where your food was coming from. It was a total hand-to-mouth existence.
And it sounds to me like there was the most basic and minimum of safety nets in Victorian London? Or would sometimes these people tramping just simply keel over and die through lack of food and...
Yeah, quite literally. Yeah, they would. But something really interesting that I found out is, there is this misconception that we have had that all women who were completely destitute turned to prostitution. Actually is not true. A lot of them turn to begging and a kind of itinerant life. You could be homeless and not a prostitute, but obviously society equated these 2 things together. It's really interesting. There was this whole kind of economy of the slum. So the very poor helped out the very poor. So even, for example, you might turn up at a lodging house and you didn't have 4 pennies for your bed and your board, but, you could ask around in the communal kitchen and somebody might, toss a penny your way, give you some used tea leaves to actually make a brew for yourself. And the community looked after each other this way. You wouldn't always be successful in getting somebody to stump up the extra couple pence for your bed, but there was this this kind of unofficial economy going on. Also, you're constantly pawning things. You can always find something to sell on. And people made do, just clinging on that way. Some women did supplement their lives with prostitution. But I think it's really important to say that not all did. And even the police commissioner, Sir Charles Warren, in his correspondence, recognized this. He said, of all the women living in the lodging houses, it is impossible to say how many are prostitutes from the ordinary working class population.
What are the sources like for these women's lives? And are you simply reading about other women in these conditions and then extrapolating and describing, or do we have pretty good information about the women who ended up victims of Jack the Ripper?
Well, it's a little bit of both, really. I mean, you can look at their circumstances. For example, so I was able to go to workhouse records, censuses, birth and death records, all sorts of things like this, in addition to newspaper articles which were published, when there was a little bit of investigative journalism done into their lives. Not a vast amount, but enough interviews, especially towards the end of the Autumn of Terror, as they called it. The last two, Catherine Eddowes and Mary Jane Kelly, had perhaps a little bit more written about them than the others did. And you can work backwards through their stories and corroborate evidence, but then also you layer on the experiences of other women of their class, of their time, and you build up a larger picture of what the possibilities of their lives were like and what their experiences were like.
Well, it sounds like we know more about these women than we know about Jack the Ripper, who we're not even sure existed.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is the irony of all of this. For years, for 130 years, our attention has been on figuring out who Jack the Ripper is and solving these murders. And actually, to be perfectly honest, there's no imperative anymore, is there? I mean, he's dead. Everybody who had anything to do with this case is dead. Any witness in this case is dead. Jack the Ripper is dead, unless he's some supernatural being, and I would certainly discourage that line of thinking. So the imperative to figure out who Jack the Ripper was is just gone. And effectively, we owe it to these women to know who they were, especially when there is this information out there. And, it's time to tell their stories.
Okay, well, let's very briefly précis each one now. So let's start with the first victim.
The first victim was Polly Nichols. Polly grew up in the area known as the River of Ink around Fleet Street. And she came from a printing family. And she had an education. She was literate. She married a man called William Nichols. Her maiden name was Walker originally. And William Nichols was a printer as well. And the family eventually moved to Camberwell and that area. And when social housing was being built for the first time, it was invested in by a man called George Peabody, who was an American who wanted to give an enormous bequest to this country's poor. He invested in social housing, and the Nichols family was some of the first to be approved for this incredible project, in Lambeth. These mod con flats with heating, and where the children had separate rooms, and there was a toilet, and there was a place where you could do your washing on the roof and your drying, and there were baths in the basement, and it was just amazing. And so they were approved for this. But unfortunately, Polly and her husband fell out. It was believed that he was having an affair with the next-door neighbor, which he then went on to move out of the Peabody flats with and have children with, and she left him. It was a very bold move, but there were no safety nets for women in that era, and she had to go straight into the workhouse. And from there, she became an alcoholic. She lived with her father for a while, and her life started to deteriorate. She eventually, we know because there is evidence of this, she was found sleeping rough in Trafalgar Square at around the time of the Trafalgar Square riots in 1887, and bounced in and out of workhouses. She was given an opportunity to work as a maid in the house of a woman who was a reformer and took in people from the workhouse, and that didn't last long, and eventually she ended up in Whitechapel. Then the next victim is Annie Chapman. And Annie Chapman's story is incredibly surprising because Annie was really sort of lower middle class. And her father was a trooper in the 2nd Life Guard, a very prestigious regiment. He was present for Queen Victoria's wedding, and Annie lived her life between Knightsbridge and Windsor. Eventually, her father killed himself. He was an alcoholic, and unfortunately, Annie inherited this tendency towards alcohol. She married a man who was what we would call a gentleman's coachman. So he drove coaches for noblemen, titled gentlemen, and eventually went to work for a man called Sir Francis Tress-Berry, who had an estate in Windsor, just outside of Windsor. And Annie and her children lived there for a while, until Annie's alcoholism got the better of her, and she went into one of the first women's rehabilitation centres in Britain for a year. And unfortunately, that was not successful, and she ended up splitting with her husband and eventually ended up in Whitechapel as well. The third victim was Elizabeth Stride. And Elizabeth Stride was born in Sweden. She was the daughter of a farmer. Not a very prosperous farmer, but also not a poor farmer either. And she eventually went to Gothenburg to get a job as a servant, which she did. And then at some point when she was working in the household of a Swedish caretaker of land and buildings, she ended up getting pregnant and contracting syphilis at a time when Sweden had just brought in laws much like the Contagious Diseases Acts in this country, which meant that if you were a woman and you're suspected of prostitution and you're without a man and you're pregnant, you go on the register of prostitutes, whether or not you are a prostitute. And so Elizabeth was put into, well, kind of by the state, prostitution. And she was treated for syphilis. She had a miscarriage. It was a terrible experience until she was, again, rescued by a missionary. We believe she was a missionary who took her in as a servant. Then eventually she immigrated to England. She worked for a family in Hyde Park, and then for a woman who ran a fairly posh lodging house on Gower Street. She married a carpenter. She then went on to become the keeper of a coffee house with her husband in Poplar. And they fell on financial hard times. They both ended up in the workhouse. He died. He left her destitute. She ended up going back to prostitution briefly. We don't know if she was a prostitute when she was killed, but her life had certainly spiraled downhill quite considerably. Catherine Eddowes was the fourth victim, and Catherine was born in Wolverhampton. She was the daughter of a union agitator. He was a tin worker, and he got himself into trouble in the 1840s for pulling a lot of men out on strike with him, and went to Stafford jail to walk on the treadwheel. And when he got out of prison, there was no place for him in Wolverhampton, and he had to take the family to London. And they lived in Bermondsey. Eventually, Catherine's parents, when she was a young teenager, both died of tuberculosis, and she was shipped off back to Wolverhampton. She never quite settled in. She worked in the tin factories until she fell in love with a man who was a ballad salesman. And she travelled with him around the country, writing and peddling ballads and singing ballads until she came back to London. And she and her husband fell on very hard times. He beat her, and eventually they split. And she had become a fully fledged alcoholic by then, by the time she ended up in Whitechapel. And finally, Mary Jane Kelly, who is probably the best known of all of the victims. She's certainly the most eulogized. She was the most beautiful. She was 25. Mary Jane Kelly, interestingly, was not of the lower echelons of prostitution. She was a high-class prostitute who lived in Knightsbridge and practiced in Piccadilly at that time. And we believe that she was caught up in a people trafficking ring and was trafficked to Paris and managed to escape and was hiding out on the Ratcliffe Highway from the people she escaped from, and quite probably changed her name to Mary Jane Kelly at that point, because nothing prior to her appearance in London is known. So we don't know. She claimed to have come from Wales. She claimed to have come from Ireland. Every story she tells contradicts the other. So it was believed, she really did change her name. Her name was not Mary Jane Kelly. Eventually, she was The final victim, she was actually the only victim to be killed indoors in what was called a furnished room off Dorset Street, Miller's Court, number 13, where it is believed that the Ripper got in somehow, possibly through a broken window, which she used to unlatch the door to get into.